The Aztecs, a documentary journey. Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the Aztecs. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city rising from the middle of a lake. Imagine causeways stretching across water like stone ribbons, connecting an island metropolis to the shores of a mountain valley. Imagine pyramids painted in brilliant colors, their steps ascending toward the sky. Imagine canals instead of streets, canoes instead of carts, and gardens floating on the water's surface. Imagine a marketplace larger than any in Europe, filled with goods from 1,000 miles away. This was Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before. But to understand this magnificent city, to truly comprehend what the Aztecs built and who they were, we must journey back through time. We must travel to a period when their ancestors were wanderers, when they had no empire, no great city, no name that would echo through history. We must begin not with triumph, but with migration, not with power, but with prophecy. The story of the Aztecs is not simply a tale of one people. It is a story woven from many threads, a tapestry created by centuries of migration, cultural exchange, warfare, and innovation in the Valley of Mexico. It is a story that begins long before the Aztecs themselves emerged, in a time when great civilizations rose and fell, leaving behind ruins, knowledge, and mysteries that would inspire those who came after. The ancient foundation, the Valley of Mexico, where our story unfolds, is a high plateau surrounded by mountains, sitting some 7,000 feet above sea level. In ancient times, much of this valley was covered by a system of interconnected lakes: Lake Texcoco, Lake Xochimilco, Lake Chalco, Lake Zaltocan, and Lake Zumpango. These lakes were fed by mountain streams and springs, and their waters varied from fresh in the south to brackish and salty in the north. The climate was temperate. The soil was rich with volcanic minerals, and the lakes teemed with fish and waterfowl. It was an ideal environment for human settlement, and people had lived here for thousands of years before the Aztecs arrived. The first great civilization to flourish in central Mexico was Teotihuacan, a city that reached its zenith between 100 and 650 CE. At its height, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, home to perhaps 125,000 people or more. Its massive pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, still stand today, monuments to a civilization whose true name we do not even know. The people of Teotihuacan left no written records that we can read, and by the time the Aztecs arrived in the valley, the great city had been abandoned for centuries. But its ruins remained, impressive and mysterious, and the Aztecs would come to view this place as sacred, believing it was where the gods had gathered to create the sun and moon of the current age. After Teotihuacan's collapse, the Valley of Mexico saw the rise and fall of other powers. The Toltecs, centered at their capital of Tula to the north, dominated much of central Mexico from roughly 900 to 1150 CE. The Toltecs would become legendary to the Aztecs, remembered as great warriors and craftsmen, the inheritors of Teotihuacan's glory. The Aztecs would claim descent from Toltec nobility, seeking to legitimize their rule by connecting themselves to this prestigious lineage. Whether these claims were true or invented, they reveal something important about Aztec thinking. They understood that power rested not just on military might, but on cultural prestige and historical legitimacy. By the time the Aztecs entered the Valley of Mexico in the 13th century, the political landscape was fragmented. The Toltec Empire had collapsed, and numerous city-states competed for dominance. These city-states were inhabited by various ethnic groups, but they shared a common cultural heritage, that we call Mesoamerican civilization. They practiced intensive agriculture, built cities around ceremonial centers, organized themselves into complex hierarchies, worshipped similar gods, played a ritual ball game, practiced human sacrifice, and used pictographic writing systems. Into this world of competing city-states came a group of migrants who called themselves the Mexica, though they would eventually be called by another name, Aztec. The wanderers arrive. The origin story of the Aztecs, as they themselves told it, begins in a mythical place called Aztlan. The name means place of whiteness or place of herons, and it was supposedly located somewhere to the northwest of the Valley of Mexico. The exact location of Aztlan has never been determined. Perhaps it was real, perhaps purely mythical, or perhaps it was a folk memory of their distant origins transformed by centuries of retelling into legend. What matters is that the Aztecs believed they came from Aztlan, and that they undertook a long migration, guided by their patron god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of war and the sun. According to their histories, recorded in pictographic codices and later written down in alphabetic script after the Spanish conquest, the Mexica left Aztlan around 1100 CE, though dates vary in different accounts. They were not alone. They traveled with other tribes, all related groups speaking the Nahuatl language. These tribes would eventually settle in different parts of central Mexico, but the Mexica's journey would be the longest and most arduous. Huitzilopochtli, speaking through his priests, gave the Mexica a mission. They were to wander until they found a specific sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. There they would establish their city and fulfill their destiny as the chosen people of the sun god. This prophecy would drive them forward through decades of wandering, through hardship and rejection, through struggles that would have broken a less determined people. The migration itself was not a simple journey from point A to point B. The Mexica would stop for years, sometimes decades, at various locations, building temporary settlements, planting crops, and interacting with the peoples they encountered. Sometimes they were welcomed, sometimes tolerated, sometimes attacked and driven away. They were not seen as particularly special during these early years. They were just another group of migrants, barbarians from the north, Chichimecs, as the civilized peoples of central Mexico, called all northern tribes. The Mexica arrived at the edges of the Valley of Mexico around 1250 CE. By this time, the valley was densely populated. The most powerful city-states included Culhuacan, which claimed direct descent from the Toltecs, Azcapotzalco, seat of the Tepanec Kingdom, and Texcoco on the eastern shore of the lake. These were sophisticated urban centers with elaborate social hierarchies, monumental architecture, and complex political systems. The newly arrived Mexica, by contrast, were poor, numerous, and desperate. They had nowhere to settle. The Mexica tried to establish themselves in various locations around the valley, but they were repeatedly driven away. They were seen as crude and violent, and their practices, including their devotion to Huitzilopochtli and the human sacrifices they performed in his honor, disturbed their neighbors. At one point, they served as mercenaries for Culhuacan, providing military service in exchange for a place to live. They proved to be fierce warriors, but their religious practices eventually led to a break with their Culhua hosts in a particularly gruesome incident that the chronicles describe, but which we need not detail here in full. Suffice it to say that the Mexica sacrificed a Culhua princess in a ritual that horrified her father, and they were once again driven away, forced to flee into the marshes and reeds of Lake Texcoco. This expulsion, around 1323, would prove to be the turning point in their history. Alone, despised, with nowhere else to go, the Mexica found themselves on a swampy, uninhabited island in the western part of Lake Texcoco. And there, according to their accounts, they saw the sign that Huitzilopochtli had promised: an eagle perched upon a nopal cactus with a serpent in its beak. This was the place. This would be their home. They called it Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus, and here they would build a city that would become the capital of an empire. Building a city on water. Imagine the challenges the Mexica faced on that swampy island. The land was not naturally suitable for settlement. Much of it was covered with water and reeds. There was no stone for building. There was limited space for agriculture. Fresh water was scarce, as the western lake was brackish. They had few resources and many enemies surrounding them on all sides. Most peoples would have despaired. The Mexica, instead, got to work. They began the long process of transforming their island into a city. They drove wooden piles into the lake bed to create stable foundations. They dredged up mud from the bottom of the lake to create artificial land, a technique that would expand their island over the years. They constructed chinampas, the famous floating gardens that were not actually floating, but rather artificial islands created by piling up vegetation and mud in shallow areas of the lake, then planting trees around the edges whose roots would stabilize the structure. These chinampas would become one of the most productive agricultural systems ever developed, capable of producing multiple harvests per year. The Mexica built their city according to a careful plan. At the center, they constructed the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, which would be rebuilt and expanded multiple times over the next 2 centuries. This was a twin pyramid, with stairs ascending to temples dedicated to 2 gods: Huitzilopochtli, their patron god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the ancient rain god worshipped throughout Mesoamerica. The symbolism was clear. The Mexica honored both their own unique identity and the ancient traditions they had inherited. Around this central pyramid, they laid out the city in a rough grid, with canals serving as streets and neighborhoods organized by kalpuli, kinship groups that owned land collectively and provided mutual support to their members. The early decades of Tenochtitlan's existence were difficult. The Mexica remained a weak people, surrounded by powerful neighbors. For many years, they were subjects of Azcapotzalco, the capital of the Tepanec Empire, which dominated much of the valley in the 14th century. The Mexica paid tribute to the Tepanec king Tezozomoc, sending goods and warriors to support his conquests. They were allowed to exist, but they were not free. Yet during this period of subjugation, the Mexica were learning. They were observing how their neighbors governed, how they organized their economies, how they waged war, how they legitimized their rule. They were intermarrying with noble families from other city-states, particularly Culhuacan, strengthening their claims to Toltec heritage. They were developing their military capabilities, their warriors gaining experience in Tepanec campaigns. They were building their city, improving their agriculture, growing their population. They were patient, biding their time, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in 1426 with the death of the Tepanec Emperor Tezozomoc. His death triggered a succession crisis, and his son Maxtla seized power, murdering his brothers and ruling with brutal tyranny. Maxtla saw the growing power of Tenochtitlan as a threat and demanded ever greater tribute. He insulted and threatened the Mexica king Itzcoatl. For the Mexica, this was both a crisis and an opportunity. They could submit and accept permanent subjugation, or they could risk everything in a bid for independence. They chose to fight. the Triple Alliance and the birth of empire. The war against Azcapotzalco was the defining moment in Aztec history. Under the leadership of Itzcoatl and his nephew Tlacaelel, the Mexica forged an alliance with two other city-states. Texcoco, ruled by the poet-king Nezahualcóyotl, and Tlacopan, a smaller Tepanec city that had turned against Maxtla. This alliance, which came to be known as the Triple Alliance, would form the basis of what we call the Aztec Empire, though the Aztecs themselves never used that term. They thought of themselves as the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, leaders of a coalition of allied city-states. The war was desperate. At times, the Mexica faced starvation as Azcapotzalco tried to cut off their supplies. But they persisted, and in 1428, the Allied forces captured and destroyed Azcapotzalco. Maxtla was killed, his city subjugated, and suddenly the balance of power in the Valley of Mexico had shifted dramatically. The Mexica and their allies were now the dominant power. In the aftermath of victory, the three allied cities divided the spoils. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco would be the senior partners, each receiving 2/5 of any tribute collected, while Tlacopan would receive 1/5. But increasingly, Tenochtitlan would become the dominant force, with Texcoco playing an important but secondary role, and Tlacopan fading into relative insignificance. Under Itzcoatl's reign, and with the guidance of Tlacaelel, who served as a kind of grand vizier, the Mexica undertook a remarkable transformation of their society and history. They burned the old historical codices, as some chronicles tell us, and created a new official history that emphasized their divine mission, their connection to Toltec nobility, and their destiny to rule. They restructured their society along more rigid class lines, creating a warrior aristocracy. They reformed their religious practices, placing the cult of Huitzilopochtli at the center of state ideology. They developed the concept that would drive their expansion for the next century. The idea that the Mexica had a cosmic duty to nourish the sun through human sacrifice, and that to obtain sacrificial victims, they must wage war and conquer new peoples. This ideology was not simply imposed from above. It resonated with Mexica society because it explained and justified their remarkable rise. They had been wanderers, outcasts, the people no one wanted. Now they were the most powerful force in central Mexico. Their patron god had promised them greatness, and they had achieved it. But that greatness came with a price and a responsibility. They must continue to feed the sun, to maintain the order of the cosmos, to keep the world in existence. This was both a burden and a source of immense pride. The mechanics of empire. What we call the Aztec Empire was quite different from empires like Rome or China. It was not a unified territorial state with a single administration governing all its lands. Instead, it was a hegemonic empire, a system in which subject cities maintained their own rulers and internal autonomy, but paid tribute to Tenochtitlan and its allies, provided military forces when required, and acknowledged Mexica's supremacy. Conquered cities that submitted willingly might be treated leniently, allowed to keep their ruling dynasties and much of their traditional practices. Cities that resisted might face harsher terms, including the installation of military governors and steeper tribute requirements. The empire expanded rapidly under a series of ambitious rulers. Moctezuma I, who reigned from 1440 to 1469, extended Mexica control to the Gulf Coast and south toward Oaxaca. Axayacatl, who reigned from 1469 to 1481, conquered many of the surrounding cities in the valley, including the great city of Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's northern neighbor and trade rival, which he absorbed into Tenochtitlan itself. His successor Tizoc had a brief and relatively unsuccessful reign, but then came Ahuitzotl, ruling from 1486 to 1502, who pushed the empire to its greatest extent, conquering territories in Guerrero, Oaxaca, and as far as the Soconusco region near the present-day Guatemala border. The tribute system was the backbone of imperial power. Subject cities sent goods to Tenochtitlan on a regular schedule, every 80 days, every 6 months, or annually, depending on the terms of submission. The tribute rolls that survive, recorded in pictographic manuscripts, reveal the staggering wealth that flowed into the capital. Cotton and cloth, cacao, gold dust, jade, turquoise, feathers from exotic birds, jaguar skins, honey, copal incense, maize, beans, and much more. Some cities provided specialist goods. Coastal cities sent shells and fish. Tropical regions sent cacao and cotton. Highland regions sent textiles and metals. This tribute supported the nobility, funded the military, provisioned the great religious festivals, and maintained the capital's infrastructure. But the empire's expansion was not unlimited. There were limits, zones the Mexica could not conquer despite repeated attempts. To the west lay the Tarascan Empire of Michoacán, which successfully defended its territory against Aztec aggression. To the east lay the unconquered republics of Tlaxcala and its allies, a group of city-states that maintained their independence through fierce resistance and clever diplomacy, despite being completely surrounded by Aztec-controlled territory. These unconquered enemies served a purpose in Aztec ideology. They provided venues for the flower wars, ritual conflicts designed to capture warriors for sacrifice without the total conquest that would eliminate this source of captives. The empire's military success rested on several factors. The Mexica had developed a sophisticated warrior culture with clear paths for advancement. A young man began military training in his Calpolis school. His first priority, in battle, was to capture an enemy warrior alive. This was more valued than simply killing opponents. With each captive taken, a warrior could advance in rank, earning the right to wear distinctive costumes and insignia. The highest-ranking warriors belonged to elite orders, the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors, whose members dressed in elaborate costumes evoking these powerful creatures. The Mexica armies were well organized, with clear chains of command. They used spies and scouts to gather intelligence before campaigns. They could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors, combining professional soldiers from Tenochtitlan with contingents from allied and subject cities. Their weapons included the macuahuitl, a wooden sword with obsidian blades embedded in the edges, sharp enough to decapitate a horse, as the Spanish would later discover, along with spears, atlatls, spear throwers, bows and arrows, slings, and clubs. They wore cotton armor quilted with salt, which was surprisingly effective against the weapons of Mesoamerica, though it would prove less useful against Spanish steel and firearms. Life in Tenochtitlan. By 1500, Tenochtitlan had grown into one of the largest cities in the world, with a population estimated at between 200,000 and 400,000 people. When the Spanish conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo saw it in 1519, he wrote that it was larger than any city in Spain, and that some of his companions wondered if they were dreaming. So magnificent was everything they saw. The city was connected to the mainland by 3 major causeways, one to the north, one to the south, and one to the west, each wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast, as the Spanish noted. These causeways had removable bridges that could be raised to protect the city from attack or to control access. A great aqueduct brought fresh water from springs at Chapultepec on the western shore, flowing into the city in a double channel so that one could be cleaned while the other remained in service. Canoes filled the canals, carrying people and goods through the city's waterways. The main streets, where they existed on solid ground, were kept clean by teams of workers who swept them daily. At the heart of the city was the sacred precinct, a walled compound about 400 meters on each side, containing the Great Temple and dozens of other religious structures. The Templo Mayor, rebuilt many times and growing ever larger, towered over everything else. Its twin pyramids were painted in brilliant colors: blue, red, white, and yellow. And the sanctuaries at their summits contained the images of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The plaza in front of the temple was paved with stones, and it was here that the great ceremonies took place, where thousands of people could gather to witness the rituals that maintained the cosmic order. Radiating out from the sacred center were residential districts, each organized around its kalpuli. The city was divided into 4 main quarters, and within these quarters were about 80 kalpuli. Each kalpuli had its own temple, school, and administrative center. Housing varied according to social status. The palaces of the nobility were elaborate structures with many rooms arranged around interior courtyards, with gardens, fountains, private temples, and extensive storerooms. Commoners lived in simpler dwellings, small houses with 1 or 2 rooms, built of adobe or wood, with thatched roofs. But even these modest homes were kept clean, and each had its own small shrine for household gods. The great marketplace at Tlatelolco, in the northern part of the city, was the economic heart of the empire. Bernal Diaz would write that his company, having seen the markets of Constantinople and Rome, had never seen a marketplace so large, so orderly, so well supplied with goods. Estimates suggest that on a busy day, as many as 60,000 people might be buying and selling in this market. The market was organized by product type, with each kind of merchandise occupying its own section. There were areas for vegetables, for fruits, for maize and beans, for chili peppers, for turkeys and dogs raised for food, for rabbit and venison and waterfowl. There were sections for pottery, for obsidian blades, for cotton and woven cloth, for sandals and rope, for herbs and medicines, for salt and chocolate, for gold jewelry and precious stones, for slave traders selling human beings, for everything one could possibly want. The market was governed by strict rules enforced by market judges who maintained order, checked weights and measures, and resolved disputes. Cacao beans served as a form of currency, along with small copper bells, quills filled with gold dust, and standardized lengths of cotton cloth. A turkey might cost 100 cacao beans, a small rabbit 30 beans, a canoe 1 bean. Goods came to this market from throughout the empire and beyond: cacao from the tropical lowlands, jade from the Motagua Valley and Maya territory, turquoise from the far north, shells from both the Caribbean and Pacific coasts, vanilla, rubber, copal incense, and countless other items that moved along the extensive trade networks connecting Mesoamerica. Daily life for the average person in Tenochtitlan was structured and busy. Most people were commoners, Maxahualtan in Nahuatl, who lived in their kalpuli and owed labor service to their kalpuli, to the city, and sometimes to a noble who served as the kalpuli's patron. They worked as farmers, tending chinampas where they grew maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chili peppers, amaranth, and many other crops. They worked as craftspeople: potters, weavers, carpenters, stoneworkers, feather workers. They worked as merchants, particularly the Pochteca, long-distance traders who formed their own specialized guild and traveled to distant lands to trade luxury goods, often serving as spies for the empire. Gender roles were clearly defined but complex. Men dominated public life, warfare, and most forms of political power. Women's primary domain was the household, But this did not mean they lacked influence or importance. Women managed household economies, raised children, wove cloth, an essential skill and economic contribution, prepared food, and could work as merchants, priestesses, or midwives. Both boys and girls received education, though in separate institutions. The Telpoch Kali, or House of Youth, provided training in warfare and citizenship for commoner boys. Girls were educated in domestic skills and proper behavior, but noble girls could receive sophisticated training in ritual, history, and arts. The Kalmakak, schools attached to temples, educated the children of the nobility in reading, writing, history, religion, law, and administration. Marriage was important for maintaining social order and alliances. Most people married in their late teens or early 20s. Marriages among commoners were typically arranged by families within the same social class, though couples often had some say in the matter. Polygyny was practiced by the nobility, who might have multiple wives to cement alliances with different lineages. Adultery was considered a serious crime, punishable by death for both parties if caught. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances, and widows could remarry. The cosmos and the gods. To understand the Aztecs, one must understand their worldview, their conception of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. The Aztec universe was complex, layered, and dynamic, quite different from the Christian cosmos the Spanish would bring with them. The world, in Aztec belief, had been created and destroyed multiple times. There had been 4 previous worlds, or suns, each ending in catastrophe, by jaguars, by wind, by rain, by flood. The current world was the 5th sun, created at Teotihuacan when the gods gathered to sacrifice themselves so that the sun and moon could move through the sky. This sun, called 4-motion, would eventually end in earthquakes. But its end was not inevitable or immediate. It could be postponed, perhaps indefinitely, if the sun was kept strong. And the sun's strength came from the most precious water, chalchihuatl, human blood. This was the theological foundation for human sacrifice. The Mexica did not sacrifice humans out of cruelty or bloodlust, but out of cosmic necessity. The universe required constant renewal. The gods had sacrificed themselves for humanity, and humanity must reciprocate. The sun needed nourishment to continue its daily journey across the sky and its nightly battle through the underworld. Without sacrifices, the sun would weaken and die, and the world would end. It was, in their view, humanity's sacred duty to keep the cosmos functioning. The Aztec pantheon contained hundreds of deities, many inherited from earlier Mesoamerican civilizations. Tlaloc, the rain god, was ancient and essential, for without rain, crops failed and people starved. His consort, Chalchutlicue, was the goddess of water, rivers, and lakes. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was a god of wind, wisdom, life, and the morning star, associated with priesthood and rulership. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was a god of night, sorcery, destiny, and war. Powerful, unpredictable, sometimes benevolent, and sometimes malevolent. Sipe Totec, the flayed lord, represented agricultural renewal through his ritual of wearing the skin of a sacrificial victim, symbolizing the earth being covered by new vegetation. And then there was Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica's patron deity, the god who had led them from Aztlan, who had shown them where to build their city, who had promised them greatness. He was the sun at its zenith, the god of war, the warrior who each day fought against the darkness to bring dawn. His cult was central to Mexica identity. The great temple in Tenochtitlan was his primary home, and it was to him that the majority of human sacrifices were dedicated. Religious ceremonies filled the Aztec calendar, which was actually two interlocking calendars. The 365-day solar calendar used for agricultural purposes and daily life, and the 260-day ritual calendar used for religious ceremonies and divination. The interaction of these two calendars created complex cycles, including a 52-year cycle at the end of which there was great anxiety. Would the sun rise again? Would the world continue? To ensure it did, the Mexica performed the new fire ceremony, extinguishing all fires throughout the empire, then lighting a new fire on the chest of a sacrificial victim, from which all fires in the empire would be rekindled. The scale of human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire has been a subject of intense debate. Spanish chroniclers claimed that thousands, even tens of thousands, were sacrificed during major ceremonies. Some modern historians argue these numbers were exaggerated to justify Spanish conquest by portraying the Aztecs as diabolical. Archaeological evidence, including the recent discoveries at the Templo Mayor, confirms that human sacrifice occurred on a significant scale, but the exact numbers remain uncertain. What is clear is that sacrifice was central to Aztec religion, that it took many forms, and that victims came from many sources: prisoners of war, purchased slaves, and in some cases, volunteers who saw death on the sacrificial stone as an honor. The most common form of sacrifice involved removing the heart. The victim, usually painted and dressed in costume representing the deity to whom they were being offered, would be stretched backward over a stone altar at the top of a pyramid. 4 priests held the victim's limbs, while a 5th cut open the chest with an obsidian knife and extracted the still-beating heart, which was offered to the sun before the body was rolled down the temple steps. Other forms of sacrifice included decapitation, drowning, burning, and arrow sacrifice. Some ceremonies involved ritual combat, where captives were given weapons and required to fight against Mexica warriors before their inevitable death. This practice horrifies modern sensibilities, as it horrified the Spanish. But in the Aztec worldview, it was sacred duty, not murder. The victims, particularly warriors captured in battle, were not seen as mere victims, but as participants in a sacred drama. They were told they would join the sun in his journey, that they would become honored companions of Huitzilopochtli. There are accounts of captives who went to their deaths willingly, even proudly, seeing it as a sacred role and a path to a blessed afterlife. Society's layers. Aztec society was hierarchical, with clearly defined social classes that were increasingly rigid as the empire grew. At the top was the Tlatoani, often translated as emperor or king, though neither term is quite accurate. The title literally means he who speaks, and the Tlatoani was the supreme political and military leader of Tenochtitlan, and by extension, the empire. The position was not strictly hereditary in the European sense. The Tlatoani was chosen from among the male members of the royal family by a council of high nobles, who selected the candidate they deemed most capable. In practice, the title often passed from brother to brother before moving to the next generation, allowing mature, experienced men to rule rather than young heirs. The most famous Tlatoani was Moctezuma II, who reigned from 1502 to 1520 and would be the ruler who faced the Spanish invasion. But before him came other notable rulers. Moctezuma I, great-great-grandfather of Moctezuma II, expanded the empire significantly and reformed the state, working closely with Tlacaelel. Ahuitzotl, who preceded Moctezuma II, was perhaps the most militarily successful of all Aztec rulers, conquering vast territories and celebrating the rededication of the Great Temple in 1487 with ceremonies that some Spanish sources claim involved thousands of sacrifices over several days. Below the Tlatoani were the Pipiltin, the nobility. These were descendants of the royal family, successful warriors who had been elevated, and descendants of the nobility of conquered cities who had been incorporated into the Aztec ruling class. The nobility owned land, collected tribute, served in high government and military positions, and received education in the Kalmakak schools. They were exempt from paying tribute and performing manual labor. They dressed in fine cotton clothing, wore jewelry and elaborate headdresses, lived in spacious palaces, and were carried on litters when they traveled. They practiced polygyny, maintaining multiple households to create alliance networks. The majority of the population were Masahualtan, commoners. They lived in their kalpuli, worked their lands or practiced their trades, paid tribute and performed labor service when required. Their lives were hardly luxurious, but they were not slaves, and they had certain rights and protections. A commoner's son could rise in social status through success in warfare, capturing many enemies and earning the respect of the nobility. The most successful warriors might be granted estates and elevated to a status just below the hereditary nobility. Below the commoners were various groups with fewer rights. The Mayeke were a kind of serf, bound to the estates of nobles and required to work the land in exchange for protection and a portion of the harvest. The Tlacotin were slaves, but slavery in Aztec society was quite different from the chattel slavery of later European colonial systems. People might become slaves through debt, as punishment for crimes, through being captured in war, or through selling themselves or their children in times of extreme poverty. Slaves could own property, marry free people, and their children were born free. Slaves could purchase their freedom or have it granted for various reasons. They could not be resold without their consent, except under certain circumstances. It was a form of bondage, but it was not permanent or hereditary. Cutting across these class divisions were occupational groups with their own identities and organizations. The Pochteca, long-distance merchants, formed a hereditary guild with their own deity, Yakatecutli, and their own rituals. They traveled to distant lands, often at great risk, trading the luxury goods that filled the markets of Tenochtitlan. They dressed modestly in public to avoid attracting envy, but they grew wealthy from their trade and sometimes purchased slaves to sacrifice in emulation of the nobility. The Pochteca served as spies for the empire, gathering intelligence about distant lands, and sometimes their reports would trigger military campaigns. Craftspeople also formed specialized groups. The Amanteca, feather workers, created the stunning feather mosaics and headdresses worn by nobles and used in religious ceremonies. Working with the iridescent green feathers of the Quetzal bird, the blue feathers of the cotinga, the red feathers of the roseate spoonbill, and many others, they created works of astonishing beauty. These craftspeople lived in their own districts, passed their skills from parent to child, and served the nobility and temples with their art. Daily rhythms and sustenance food was central to Aztec life, as it is to all human societies, but the Aztec diet was distinctly Mesoamerican, based on crops domesticated over thousands of years in the Americas. The foundation was maize, or corn, which was consumed in dozens of forms. Dried kernels were soaked in lime water to remove the hull, ground on a matat stone into dough called nixtamal, and shaped into tortillas cooked on a comal griddle. Maize also became tamales, dough wrapped in corn husks or banana leaves and steamed, often filled with beans, squash, chili peppers, turkey, or fish. Atole, a nutritious drink made from maize dough mixed with water, was consumed at breakfast by people of all classes. Beans were the second staple, providing essential protein. The Aztecs grew many varieties: black beans, red beans, pinto beans, which they ate boiled, mashed, or mixed with other foods. Squash and its seeds were important, as were chili peppers, which came in many varieties and heat levels. Tomatoes, both the large red variety and the small tomatillo with its papery husk, formed the base for countless sauces and stews. The chinampas produced an abundance of vegetables: amaranth, whose seeds were ground into flour; sage called chia, whose seeds provided nutrition and could be stored for long periods; various greens, and edible flowers. From the lakes came protein: fish, frogs, axolotl salamanders, insect eggs, and waterfowl. From the land came turkeys, dogs raised for meat, rabbits, deer, and various game birds. Protein was relatively scarce compared to carbohydrates, and meat was more available to the nobility than to commoners. Cacao held a special place in Aztec culture. The beans came from tropical regions as tribute, and chocolate drinks were consumed by the elite. The beans were ground and mixed with water, maize, chili peppers, vanilla, or other flavorings, then frothed by pouring from a height. This chocolate drink was bitter, nothing like modern sweetened chocolate, and it was associated with luxury, ritual, and even divinity. Cacao beans were so valuable they served as currency. Pulque, a fermented drink made from the sap of the maguey cactus, was the only widely consumed alcoholic beverage. It was nutritious, providing vitamins and probiotics, but it was also intoxicating. Pulque consumption was regulated. Public drunkenness was considered shameful and could be punished, but the elderly were permitted to drink more freely, and pulque featured in religious festivals where controlled intoxication had ritual purposes. The Mexica ate 2 main meals a day. Breakfast was light: atole and perhaps some tortillas. The main meal came in the afternoon, after the heat of the day, when the family gathered to share food. People ate sitting on mats, using tortillas to scoop up food from communal dishes. Pottery vessels held water, pulque, or chocolate. The nobility ate much more elaborate meals, with many courses, exotic ingredients from throughout the empire, and elaborate presentation. The Tlatoanis' meals were particularly sumptuous, with dozens of dishes prepared by specialist cooks, though he ate alone, separated from even his highest nobles by protocol. Clothing indicated social status. Commoners wore simple garments made from coarse maguey fiber cloth. Men wore a loincloth and often a cloak tied at the shoulder. Women wore a skirt and a huipil, a tunic-like top. People went barefoot or wore simple sandals. The nobility dressed in fine cotton, which commoners were forbidden to wear. Noble garments featured elaborate designs, often including the featherwork created by specialist craftspeople. Nobles wore jewelry: gold armbands, earrings, nose plugs, lip plugs, necklaces of jade or turquoise. Their clothing used bright colors derived from various plant and mineral dyes, with cochineal insects providing a particularly brilliant red. Personal hygiene was important to the Aztecs. They bathed regularly, often in the lake or in temazcali, steam baths that served both hygienic and ritual purposes. They washed their clothes, swept their homes and streets, and generally maintained cleanliness. The Spanish, whose hygiene standards were relatively poor by comparison, noted this tendency with some surprise. The arts of civilization. The Aztecs were not merely warriors and priests. They were also artists, poets, architects, astronomers, and philosophers. Nahuatl, their language, was sophisticated and poetic, capable of expressing complex ideas and emotions. Aztec poetry often reflected on the transience of life, the inevitability of death, and the search for meaning in a world that would eventually end. One of the most famous Aztec poets was Nezahualcóyotl, the ruler of Texcoco, who wrote, "I love the song of the mockingbird, bird of 400 voices. I love the color of jade and the enervating perfume of flowers, but more than all, I love my brother, man." And on the transience of life, we only come to dream, we only come to sleep. It is not true. It is not true that we come to live on earth. As the grass in springtime, so are we. Our hearts will grow green again and open their petals, but our body is like a rose tree. It puts forth flowers and then it withers. This philosophical reflection on mortality, on the brevity of life and the importance of beauty and human connection, runs through much of Aztec literature. They knew their empire would not last forever. They knew that death came for everyone, that even the sun itself would one day fail. This awareness of impermanence did not make them passive or nihilistic. Rather, it intensified their commitment to glory, to achievement, to living fully and courageously. Aztec visual arts were sophisticated and meaningful. Sculpture ranged from colossal stoneworks like the Sunstone, a massive circular carving 12 feet in diameter depicting Aztec cosmology, to delicate small figures carved from jade or obsidian. Much Aztec art had religious significance, depicting gods, representing cosmological concepts, or serving ritual functions. But there was also a strong naturalistic tradition. Sculptures of animals, carvings of plants, representations of everyday objects rendered with careful attention to detail. Featherwork was perhaps the most distinctly Aztec art form. Using feathers from tropical birds, artisans created mosaics, headdresses, shields, and cloaks of stunning beauty. The most famous surviving example is the Moctezuma's headdress, housed in Vienna, though whether it actually belonged to Moctezuma II is debated. This magnificent piece contains more than 200 long green, quetzal tail feathers mounted on a base decorated with gold ornaments and blue cotinga feathers. It represents hundreds of hours of meticulous work by master craftspeople. Music and dance were integral to Aztec life, particularly in religious ceremonies. Musicians played drums of various sizes, including the vertical huhuetl and the horizontal teponaztli, made from hollowed logs, flutes, whistles, rattles, and conch shell trumpets. Dances were often highly choreographed, with performers moving in precise patterns while wearing elaborate costumes. Some dances told stories, others honored specific deities, and still others marked important occasions like military victories or agricultural festivals. Architecture reflected both practical needs and cosmological beliefs. The Great Temple in Tenochtitlan was aligned to specific astronomical events. It faced west, toward the setting sun, and the two stairways leading to the twin temples at its summit represented the symbolic mountains sacred to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The temple complex was repeatedly enlarged, with each new version built over the previous one, like layers of an onion. Archaeologists have found 7 major construction phases, each larger and more elaborate than the last. The Aztecs were keen astronomers, tracking the movements of sun, moon, planets, and stars. They had calculated the solar year to 365.422 days, remarkably accurate. They tracked Venus, which had important ritual significance. They could predict eclipses. Their ritual calendar of 260 days was based on observations of human gestation and agricultural cycles. Priests used astronomy for divination, determining auspicious days for various activities, predicting the future based on the movements of celestial bodies. Mathematics and writing were both sophisticated, though different from European systems. The Aztecs used a vigesimal base 20 number system, rather than the decimal base 10 system used in Europe. They could perform complex calculations necessary for tribute accounting, astronomical observations, and calendar calculations. Their writing system was pictographic and ideographic, not phonetic like alphabetic systems. It could record historical events, tribute lists, religious concepts, calendrical information, and more. After the Spanish conquest, the writing system was adapted to incorporate phonetic elements, allowing it to record the sounds of Nahuatl more precisely, and many important historical and cultural documents were created in this hybrid system in the decades following the conquest. The final Tlatoani. In 1502, Ahuitzotl died accidentally. According to some accounts, he struck his head while fleeing a flood, and the Council of Nobles selected his nephew Moctezuma II to become the 9th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma II, often called Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the Younger, to distinguish him from his great-great-grandfather Moctezuma I, was about 35 years old, an experienced military leader and a priest of Huitzilopochtli. Moctezuma II was by all accounts an imposing figure, tall, well-proportioned, with a grave and thoughtful demeanor. He was pious, observing all the rituals and fasts required of a devout follower of the gods. He was also concerned with maintaining the majesty and distance appropriate to his supreme position. He increased the ceremony and protocol surrounding the Tlatoani, requiring even high nobles to approach him barefoot and with downcast eyes. He ate alone, separated from others by screens. He never wore the same clothes twice, and he had hundreds of concubines housed in separate palaces. Some historians see this as evidence of his personal preference for grandeur. Others suggest he was attempting to centralize power and elevate the position of Tlatoani to something approaching divinity. Moctezuma II continued the imperial expansion, campaigning in Oaxaca and other regions, though he also faced challenges. There were rebellions in some subject territories. The Tlaxcalans and their allies remained stubbornly independent, despite repeated campaigns. And there were troubling omens. The chronicles tell us that in the years before the Spanish arrival, strange portents appeared. A comet blazed in the sky. The temple of Huitzilopochtli burned mysteriously. Lightning struck a temple without thunder. The lake boiled and flooded parts of the city without wind. A weeping woman was heard in the night crying, "My dear children, where shall I take you?" Fishermen caught a strange bird with a mirror in its head, and when Moctezuma looked into the mirror, he saw armed men riding on the backs of deer, a vision of mounted Spaniards, though he could not have understood it at the time. How much of this is real, and how much was invented or embellished after the fact to make the conquest seem fated, we cannot know. But what is certain is that in 1519, reports reached Moctezuma of strange ships with white sails appearing off the coast, carrying bearded men with pale skin who wore metal clothing and rode enormous deer, who carried sticks that roared like thunder and spat lightning, who were accompanied by giant dogs like none ever seen before. The Spaniards had arrived. The world breaks. The Spanish expedition that would destroy the Aztec Empire was led by Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from Extremadura who had come to the Caribbean seeking his fortune. In 1519, he sailed from Cuba with about 600 men, some horses, cannons, and authorization from the governor of Cuba to explore and trade along the Mexican coast, though not to conquer or establish settlements. Cortés, ambitious and willful, would exceed his authorization in every possible way. The Spanish landed first on the island of Cozumel, then proceeded along the coast of Yucatan. At the Tabasco River, They fought a battle with local Maya, winning decisively thanks to their horses, steel weapons, and guns, which terrified the indigenous warriors who had never seen such things. After this battle, the defeated Maya gave the Spanish gifts, including 20 young women. One of these women, who would be baptized as Marina, and whom the Spanish called Malinche or Doña Marina, spoke both Maya and Nahuatl. She would become Cortez's translator, advisor, and eventually his mistress, playing a crucial role in the conquest. Moctezuma learned of these strangers and sent emissaries to meet them with gifts: fine cotton cloaks, gold jewelry, featherwork. The emissaries brought artists who painted images of the strangers and their amazing possessions to send back to Moctezuma. But these gifts had an effect opposite to what Moctezuma may have intended. They convinced the Spanish that Mexico contained great wealth worth pursuing. The Spanish established a settlement they called Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, claiming the land for Spain. There they met representatives from the Totonacs, people who lived along the coast and who resented Aztec rule. The Totonacs told the Spanish about the great city in the interior, about the Emperor Moctezuma, about the empire's wealth, and also about the fear and resentment many subjects felt. This was crucial intelligence, and Cortez began to understand that the Aztec Empire, mighty as it was, had internal divisions he could exploit. After burning his ships, according to legend, though he likely just dismantled them, to prevent his men from returning to Cuba, Cortez began the march inland toward Tenochtitlan. The Spanish force was small, but they had advantages: steel swords and armor, horses, guns, and crossbows. They also had devastating biological weapons they didn't even know they carried. Diseases like smallpox, to which they were immune, but which would kill millions of indigenous Americans who had no immunity. The march took them through Tlaxcala, the republic that had resisted Aztec conquest. The Tlaxcalans initially fought the Spanish fiercely, but after several battles and complex negotiations, they became Spanish allies. This was perhaps the single most important factor in the Spanish conquest. The Tlaxcalans contributed thousands of warriors to the Spanish cause, providing both military muscle and essential local knowledge. They saw the Spanish as potential allies against their hated Aztec enemies. When the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies approached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, Moctezuma faced an impossible decision. Should he attack them? But they had defeated everyone who fought them, and they had many allies now. Should he refuse them entry? But what if they were, as some believed, connected to the god Quetzalcoatl, who in legend had sailed east and promised to return? The sources are contradictory about whether Moctezuma actually believed Cortez might be Quetzalcoatl or a representative of that god, or whether this idea was invented later to explain his seemingly passive response. Whatever his reasoning, Moctezuma decided to receive the Spanish as guests. On November 8, 1519, the Spanish entered Tenochtitlan. They crossed the southern causeway, lined with thousands of Mexica who watched in silence. They met Moctezuma, who was carried on a golden litter, dressed in his finest regalia. The Tlatoani and the conquistador greeted each other. Moctezuma gave gifts of gold and feathers. Cortez responded with glass beads and a necklace. Through Malinche, they conversed. Moctezuma lodged the Spanish in the palace of Axayacatl, a sumptuous building that had been the residence of a previous ruler. For a few months, there was an uneasy coexistence. The Spanish explored the city, marveling at its wonders, but also horrified by the temples where human sacrifices occurred. They discovered rooms full of tribute treasure. Then, hearing of an attack on Spanish at the coast, Cortez took an extraordinary step. He seized Moctezuma effectively making the emperor a hostage in his own capital. Moctezuma, incredibly, continued to rule from captivity, possibly believing that cooperation was the best way to protect his people, possibly hoping for an opportunity to turn the tables, possibly paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of his situation. The situation exploded when Cortés had to leave the city to deal with a Spanish expedition sent from Cuba to arrest him for exceeding his authority. He left Pedro de Alvarado in command in Tenochtitlan. During a religious festival, Alvarado, for reasons that remain debated, ordered his men to attack and massacre the unarmed Mexica nobles who were performing a ceremonial dance. Hundreds were killed. The city rose in fury. When Cortés returned, he found Tenochtitlan in revolt. The Spanish were besieged in their palace under constant attack. Cortés convinced Moctezuma to address his people, to calm them, to tell them to stop fighting. Moctezuma appeared on the palace roof and began to speak. The sources differ on what happened next. Spanish sources say the Mexica threw stones and shot arrows, that Moctezuma was struck and later died from his wounds. Aztec sources suggest the Spanish killed him. What is certain is that Moctezuma died during the siege, either from his wounds or by Spanish hands, and with his death, any chance of peaceful resolution died as well. The Mexica chose a new Tlatoani, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, who had opposed the Spanish from the start. He organized the defense of the city. The Spanish, realizing they were trapped, attempted to escape on the night of June 30th, 1520, a night the Spanish would call La Noche Triste, the sad night. They tried to sneak across the western causeway under cover of darkness, but they were discovered. In the battle that followed, hundreds of Spanish and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies died. Many drowned in the lake, weighed down by gold they had tried to carry away. Cortés supposedly wept beneath a tree when he realized the extent of his losses. But he survived, and he escaped with a corps of his men. The Mexica had won, or so it seemed. The invaders had been driven out, but the Spanish had left something behind, invisible and more deadly than any weapon: smallpox. The disease spread through the city, killing tens of thousands. Cuitlahuac himself died of smallpox after ruling for just 80 days. The Mexica chose a new Tlatoani, Cuauhtémoc, a young warrior, nephew of Moctezuma and son-in-law of Cuitlahuac, who would be the last independent ruler of the Mexica. Cortés, meanwhile, had regrouped. He received reinforcements from Cuba. He forged alliances with more indigenous groups resentful of Aztec rule. He built brigantines, small ships, which his men carried in pieces across the mountains to the lake, where they were assembled. He laid siege to Tenochtitlan, cutting off the causeways, preventing food and water from entering, attacking repeatedly. The siege lasted 93 days, from May to August 1521. The Mexica fought with desperate courage, defending their city district by district, building by building. Women and children fought alongside the men. They melted down gold to make weapons. They ate bark and leather when their food ran out. Smallpox continued to ravage the population. Spanish brigantines controlled the lake, preventing escape or resupply. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured trying to escape by canoe. He was brought before Cortés. According to some accounts, Cuauhtémoc asked Cortés to kill him, saying, "I have done all I could to defend my kingdom, and since I can do no more, I come before you by force as a prisoner. Take your dagger and kill me with it." Cortés refused to kill him immediately, hoping to learn where treasure was hidden. Cuauhtémoc was tortured but revealed nothing, or perhaps there was nothing more to reveal, as much of the treasure had been lost during La Noche Triste or destroyed during the siege. He would be kept prisoner for several years before being executed on a later Spanish expedition to Honduras. Tenochtitlan fell. The city that had taken nearly 2 centuries to build, the jewel of the Valley of Mexico, was largely destroyed. The Spanish systematically dismantled the temples and palaces, using the stones to build their colonial capital, which they called Mexico City. The surviving Mexica, devastated by warfare, disease, and famine, were forced to rebuild the city according to Spanish plans, creating the colonial city that would sit atop the ruins of the Aztec capital. After the fall, the conquest of Tenochtitlan did not immediately end indigenous resistance. It took several more years for the Spanish to subdue other regions of Mesoamerica. Some areas were never fully conquered, their populations fleeing to remote mountains or jungles. But the heart of the Aztec Empire had been broken, and the Old World was ending. The demographic catastrophe that followed was staggering. Disease was the main killer. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other European diseases swept through populations that had no immunity. Historians estimate that the indigenous population of central Mexico, which may have been 20 to 25 million in 1519, had fallen to about 1 million by 1600. This was one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. Entire communities disappeared. Traditional knowledge was lost. Languages died out. The Spanish imposed their colonial system. Indigenous peoples were forced to provide labor and tribute, now to Spanish encomenderos rather than to Mexican nobles. Many of the old social structures were destroyed or transformed. The Catholic Church launched a massive campaign to convert the indigenous population, destroying temples, burning codices considered idolatrous, and persecuting traditional religious practices. Yet Christianity in Mexico would take on distinctive forms, blending with indigenous beliefs in ways the Spanish missionaries could not entirely prevent. Some Mexican nobles who cooperated with the Spanish maintained a degree of power and privilege under the colonial system. They learned Spanish, adopted Spanish customs, sent their children to be educated by Spanish friars. They wrote accounts of their history and culture, trying to preserve what was being lost. Thanks to their efforts, much of what we know about Aztec civilization comes from these post-conquest documents. The Florentine Codex compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, with indigenous informants, the various native chronicles, the legal documents where indigenous nobles claimed their rights based on pre-conquest status. The Nahuatl language survived, and millions of people speak variants of it today in Mexico, though it has evolved and incorporated Spanish loanwords. Many Mexican cultural traditions have roots in the Aztec past. Foods, agricultural practices, craft techniques, place names, and cultural attitudes. The Virgin of Guadalupe, the dark-skinned virgin who appeared to an indigenous man in 1531, became a powerful symbol of Mexican identity, bridging indigenous and Spanish cultures. For centuries, the Aztec past was viewed negatively in Mexico, associated with the pagan and barbaric practices that Spanish conquest and Christian conversion had supposedly redeemed. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, as Mexico sought to forge a national identity distinct from Spanish colonialism, the Aztec past was reclaimed. The eagle on the cactus devouring a serpent became Mexico's national symbol, adorning the flag and coat of arms. Aztec imagery appears throughout Mexican art, literature, and architecture. Aztec philosophy and poetry are studied in schools. Archaeological sites are preserved as national treasures. Yet this reclamation is complex and sometimes controversial. Modern Mexican identity is mestizo, mixed, both indigenous and Spanish, Aztec and European. Not all indigenous people in Mexico are descended from the Aztecs. There were and are hundreds of distinct indigenous groups in Mexico, many of whom were conquered by the Aztecs and did not view them as liberators or heroes. The appropriation of Aztec imagery by the modern Mexican state sometimes sits uneasily with the reality of continued discrimination against indigenous peoples in contemporary Mexico. Reflections on Empire. As we reach the end of this long journey through Aztec history, it is worth reflecting on what we have learned, and perhaps on what the Aztecs can teach us about civilization, empire, human nature, and the impermanence of even the mightiest achievements. The Aztecs built an empire from almost nothing. They arrived in the Valley of Mexico as despised migrants, outcasts without land or prestige. Within 2 centuries, they had created one of the largest cities in the world and dominated an empire that stretched from sea to sea across central Mexico. This transformation required not just military prowess, but also diplomatic skill, administrative capability, engineering knowledge, and cultural sophistication. The Mexica did not simply conquer. They built, they organized, they created. Yet their empire was also built on violence and the subjugation of others. The tribute system enriched Tenochtitlan, but impoverished subject peoples. The constant warfare required by their ideology of cosmic necessity created resentment and hatred. When the Spanish arrived, they found ready allies among peoples who saw a chance to overthrow Aztec domination. The empire's strength was also its weakness. It had grown too quickly, conquered too many, created too many enemies. When the center was struck, the whole structure collapsed. The Aztec religious system, with its emphasis on human sacrifice, is perhaps the aspect of their civilization that most troubles modern observers. It is tempting to dismiss it as simple barbarism, to see the Aztecs as uniquely bloodthirsty. But this view is too simple. Every civilization has practices that seem normal to its people, but horrify outsiders. The Aztecs believed they were maintaining the cosmos, fulfilling a sacred duty without which the world would end. They were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They were devout, acting according to their deepest beliefs about the nature of reality and humanity's place in it. Moreover, we should be cautious about judging the Aztecs too harshly, while excusing or minimizing the violence of other civilizations, including our own. The Spanish who conquered them were themselves products of a culture that burned heretics alive, that conducted the Inquisition, that would later enslave millions of Africans and work them to death in mines and plantations. Every powerful civilization in history has been built, at least in part, on violence against others. The Aztecs are not unique in this. They are simply more honest about it in their own accounts, acknowledging violence as central to their worldview rather than masking it behind claims of civilization, progress, or divine right. The fall of the Aztec Empire was swift and devastating, but it was not inevitable. If circumstances had been slightly different, if smallpox had not devastated the population, if Tlaxcala had not allied with the Spanish, if the Spanish ships had never arrived at all, the Aztec Empire might have continued for centuries, or it might have fallen in some different way, torn apart by internal rebellion or external invasion or environmental catastrophe. Empires do not last forever. The Aztecs knew this better than most. Their own theology told them the world was temporary, that the fifth sun would eventually fail, that nothing lasts. The Aztec legacy is complex and multifaceted. They left behind magnificent art, sophisticated literature, impressive architectural and engineering achievements, detailed astronomical knowledge, a rich tradition of poetry and philosophy, and a language that still lives. They also left behind evidence of practices that disturb us, remind us of humanity's capacity for cruelty justified by ideology, and challenge our assumptions about what civilization means. Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Aztecs is about perspective, about trying to understand people on their own terms, rather than simply judging them by ours, about recognizing that all human societies, including our own, will one day be ancient history, puzzled over by future people who may struggle to understand why we believed what we believed and did what we did. The beauty in transience. Let us return, for a moment, to the poetry of Nezahualcoyotl, the philosopher king of Texcoco, who lived through the height of Aztec power and who understood, perhaps better than most, the impermanence of all human achievement. All the earth is a grave, and nothing escapes it. Nothing is so perfect that it does not descend to its tomb. Rivers, rivulets, fountains, and waters flow, but never return to their joyful beginnings. They hasten on to the vast realms of the rain god. As they widen their banks, they also fashion the sad urn of their burial. And yet, despite this awareness of mortality and loss, Nezahualcoyotl did not counsel despair. Let us have friends here. It is the time to know our faces. Only with flowers can our song enrapture. We will have gone to his home, but our words shall live here on earth. We will go, leaving behind our grief, our song. For this will be known, the song shall remain real. We will have gone to his home, but our word shall live here on earth. This is the paradox at the heart of Aztec civilization. The acute awareness that all things pass, that death comes for everyone, that even the sun will one day die, combined with a fierce insistence on living fully, on achieving glory, on creating beauty, on making something that will outlast individual mortality. They knew their empire would not last forever, but they built it anyway. They knew they would die, but they lived with courage and passion. They knew the world itself was temporary, but they took joy in flowers, in song, in friendship, in the beauty of existence. Tonight, we have walked through the streets of Tenochtitlan when it stood at its height, have witnessed the rituals in its great temple, have seen its markets filled with goods from across Mesoamerica, have heard its poetry and admired its art. We have followed the Mexica from their humble origins in Aztlan through their wanderings to their rise as the dominant power in central Mexico. We have seen their achievements and acknowledged their cruelty. We have witnessed their fall and considered their legacy. The Aztecs are gone. Tenochtitlan lies buried beneath Mexico City. The language has evolved. The gods are no longer worshipped, except perhaps in secret syncretized forms. But something remains, in the archaeological record, in the codices, in the language still spoken by millions, in the cultural memory of Mexico, in the universal human themes their civilization embodies. The Aztecs remind us that humans are capable of great achievements, terrible acts, beautiful creation, and profound philosophy, often within the same culture, sometimes within the same person. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine Tenochtitlan as it once was, the canals filled with canoes, the pyramids painted in brilliant colors, the sound of drums and flutes from the temples, the smell of copal incense and tortillas cooking, the voices speaking Nahuatl in the marketplace, the children playing in the streets, the nobles in their palaces, the farmers tending their chinampas, the warriors preparing for battle, the priests making offerings to the gods, the poets composing verses about flowers and mortality and friendship. All of it alive, all of it real, all of it impermanent, all of it beautiful precisely because it did not last. The fifth sun still shines in the sky. The world has not ended. But the world of the Aztecs has passed into history, leaving behind fragments for us to piece together, mysteries we will never fully solve, and questions about what civilization means, what empire costs, and what remains when all the glory has faded. Their story is part of our human story, a reminder of what we have been and what we might yet become. Rest well, and remember, nothing lasts forever. But everything that existed was real, and the echoes of the past still resonate in the present if we take the time to listen. This concludes tonight's exploration of the Aztecs, the people who called themselves Mexica, who followed their god from Aztlan, who built a great city on a lake, who created an empire that touched two seas, and whose legacy remains woven into the fabric of Mexico and the wider world. May their story inform your dreams and enrich your understanding of the remarkable complexity and diversity of human civilization. Sleep well,